So Shalom, my name is Rabbi Johnny Solomon. I am the Chief Learning Officer at WebYeshiva, and I'm so pleased to be starting off this series on the order of the Seder. Today we're going to be talking about Kaddesh, the first of the order of the Seder, the Kiddush, that is recited on Seder night. Just before we start our learning, I want to let you know that in addition to our online classes, and this series starts tonight, and please join Rabbi Uri Cohen straight afterwards for Yachatz and the many other classes taking place this week and the following weeks. I also provide online spiritual coaching and halachic consultation services, and you can book a free discovery call on our website, WebYeshiva.org. So please feel free to visit our website, look at the different classes that are taking place live, as well as the recorded classes of previous courses, as well as the page about my virtual rabbi services. But today we are focusing on the order of the Seder Kaddesh. And I'm very much looking forward to sharing some of the insights I've brought together, because Kaddesh is just often considered to be synonymous with the Kiddush. We do the Kiddush on Seder night like we do Kiddush on any Yom Tov or on any Shabbat evening, but in fact it has a dual identity, because the dual identity of Kaddesh is the fact that that first cup that we recite is a cup for the Kiddush of the Yom Tov of Pesach, but in addition to that, it is the first of the 4 cups of wine. And what I want to do in our session is understand the dual identity of the Kaddesh, these two different elements, these two different facets of that kos, or the kos rishon, the kos, the cup, being the kos of the Kaddesh, of the Kiddush, and the kos rishon of the arba kosot, of the 4 cups of wine that we drink on the night of the Seder table, right? We drink in Israel, we have 1 night of Seder. Outside of Israel, we have 2, but it's the first of the 4 cups of wine. And to begin, I'd like to explore a teaching from the Mishnah Berurah, because the Mishnah Berurah lets us know that we should be conscious of the fact that Kaddesh has 2 different identities, that we should have the kavanah, the intention that we are fulfilling 2 mitzvot, namely the mitzvah of Kiddush and the mitzvah of the first of the 4 kosot. As the Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim, explains in Siman Ktuf Ayin Gimel, Kodem she'kadesh, before you make Kiddush, yichaven she'rotzeh lekayem mitzvah Kiddush, you should have the intention that you wish to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush, v'gam mitzvah daled kosot, and also the mitzvah of the 4 cups of wine. And then he goes on as he says, shel Kiddush, shekoshel Kiddush echad me'arba kosot, because a Kiddush cup is the first of the 4 cups. V'yesh noagim lomar, and he goes on and he says, some have the custom to say, Hareinu muchan lekadesh lekayem mitzvah daled kosot. Behold, I'm readying myself to sanctify the day through Kiddush and to fulfill the mitzvah of the 4 cups. Now you may have in your Haggadah a formula like a Hareinu muchan lekadesh or lekayem mitzvah daled kosot. But the message here, the Mishnah Berurah, is be aware that you're doing 2 mitzvot. One is a mitzvah of Kiddush on Yom Tov, and one is a mitzvah of the Daled Kosot. And though they overlap in this cup, ultimately they are separate and obviously still conjoined mitzvot through this cup. So having some kind of intention when you're making Kiddush is important. And as mentioned, some people even have in their Haggadah some kind of formulation of a Hareinu Muchan Muzuman, or Hareinu Muchan Kadesh L'Kayim Mitzvat Daled Kosot. Any questions just on this point? Just being aware of the dual identity of the Kaddesh. Okay. Now, let's try and understand the first identity of the Kaddesh, namely the mitzvah of Kiddush on Yom Tov. Now, we know that we do Kiddush on Shabbat, but how do we know that we do Kiddush on Yom Tov? And especially, how do we know we do Kiddush on Yom Tov of Pesach? Well, the Midrash Sechel Tov actually brings two psukim from which we derive the mitzvah of Kiddush for Shabbat. That's not a Kiddush of the Midrash. That's already made clear in the Gemara. But then it tells us that there is a further pasuk from which we derive that we make Kiddush for Yom Tov of Pesach. Now I'm quoting the text from above, but I'm referencing the verses below, where it says, Ma ta'ama makachim ala yain kodem suda. What is the reason we make Kiddush on wine before the meal of Shabbat? Dichtiv zachot yom Shabbat lekodsho. Because it says in the Aseret Dibrot, in the Ten Commandments, remember the Sabbath day and sanctify it. We learn from the word zachor, to remember, we're supposed to do something verbally to remember and sanctify the day, and thereby we learn Zachreu alayim beknisato lekadsho al shulchancha. Remember through the wine on the entrance of Shabbat and sanctify the day on your table through making Kiddush. Continues the Midrash, Esek Kachan Shabbat. Okay, that teaches us that we make Kiddush on Shabbat. Leile Psachim Minalan. How do we know that we make Kiddush on the Yom Tov of Pesach? Dichtiv Zachor et Yom Hazeh Asher Yatzata Mimitzrayim. I've quoted this verse here from Shemot chapter 13, verse 3. Remember this day that you left Egypt. Now, hopefully what you see in this Midrash is something very fascinating. We learn from the mitzvah of Kiddush for Shabbat, the mitzvah of making Kiddush on Pesach Yom Tov. And it's derived from that same word, Zachor. Zachor, remember, with wine and through words, the Sabbath day, and thus we make Kiddush on Shabbat. And similarly, remember, with wine and with words, that we make Kiddush on Pesach. And so, this is the first aspect of the Kaddesh. The Kaddesh is making Kiddush for Pesach Yom Tov, which according to this Midrash is learned from the words, Zachor te Yom Hazeh asher yatzatem mimitzrayim, which itself riffs off, kind of, and is connected to the mitzvah of Kiddush on Shabbat, of Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho, remember the Sabbath day and sanctify it. You may say, well, why do we need to be speaking about Shabbat? We're here only talking about Kaddesh, Kaddesh of Pesach, where we make Kiddush at the beginning of the Seder table. We said there's two identities, one of Kiddush and one of the fourth Kosot. But certainly this year, Leil Seder does not fall on Shabbat. So why are we referencing the pasuk about Shabbat? Well, hopefully here we see from the Midrash that we learn about the mitzvah of Kiddush for Pesach Yom Tov from the mitzvah of Kiddush on Shabbat. But then if you look at the Rambam, he takes it even further. What does a Rambam say in Hilchot Chametz u'Matzah? Mitzvat aseh shel Torah lesaper b'nisim u'b'niflaot shna'asu l'avotenu b'Mitzrayim b'leil 15 b'Nisan. The whole notion of telling the story about the miracles of Yetziat Mitzrayim, meaning the mitzvah of Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim, we learn this. Rambam then tells us from a pasuk, Shneimar Zachor et hayom hazeh asher yatzatem mimitzrayim. Remember this day when you left Egypt. That same verse that we quoted from before from the Midrash. K'ma shneimar, we're supposed to do that just as we're supposed to do on Shabbat. Zachor et hayom HaShabbat. The Rambam is telling us that the mitzvah of Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim itself draws from the mitzvah of making Kiddush and sanctifying the Shabbat itself. So we make Kiddush on Leil Seder because we make Kiddush on Shabbat. On Shabbat, we remember the Sabbath day. We're supposed to remember God being the creator of the world. We're supposed to reflect on what that means in terms of our role in the world. And so too on Leil Seder, we make Kiddush, and we're supposed to remember not the creation, but instead a very different thing, namely that of the miracles that were wrought for our ancestors as they left Egypt. That association between Shabbat and Pesach may not be obvious to us, but Rambam is making it clear to us that we learn Sipi Yetziat Mitzrayim from a certain form of sipur, of telling, that we do on Shabbat. We learn making Kiddush on Pesach from the very fact we make Kiddush on Shabbat. And so the Kaddesh, of which one aspect of it is making Kiddush because it is Yom Tov Pesach, is connected itself with Shabbat. You may think, okay, but is there a deeper connection with Shabbat and Pesach? Well, perhaps so. Because remember, Pesach is when we shifted from being slaves to free people. And on Shabbat, we're reminded of the ability to be free, not be having to work. Shabbat is intricately involved within the story of the Exodus. That's why Shabbat was given just soon after we left Egypt. At Marah, we are told we were given the mitzvah of Shabbat. That's straight after Yetziat Mitzrayim. So there is a deep connection between Shabbat and leaving Egypt. And clearly there's a deep connection between making the Kiddush that we make on Shabbat every week and making the Kiddush that we make every year on Leil Seder. Now, just to take this idea one further step, the Midrash Rabbah, Shemot Rabbah, goes on and expands this idea and teaches us, הזהיר לישראל כשם שבראתי את העולם ואמרתי להם לישראל לזכור את יום השבת, זכר למעשה בראשית. God warned the Jewish people saying, just as I created the world and I said to the people to remember the Shabbat day as a remembrance of the creation, as it says, זכור את יום השבת, כך היו זוכרים הניסים שעשיתי לכם במצרים, וזכרו ליום שיצאתם משם, שנאמר זכור את יום הזה, אשר יצאתם ממצרים. What this midrash does is really take those two psukim we've seen previously and bond them together. We saw that the mitzvah of the Kiddush of Pesach Yom Tov is from the Kiddush of Shabbat. We saw that the mitzvah of Sipi Yetziat Mitzrayim al Leil Seder is learned from the way in which we're supposed to sanctify the Shabbat. And now the midrash comes along and says, just as I created the world, and I asked you once a week to remember what I done, and I asked you to change how you live on the Shabbat day in commemoration of the day of rest, having created the world over 6 days, so too this day, Pesach, remember the miracles I did for you in Egypt. Remember the day that you left there, and act in a way that demonstrates a full understanding of the significance of that day, namely through the celebration of Pesach and the having the Leil Seder, in which you'll tell about the miracles, you'll speak about the wonders and all those wonderful things. So far, what we've shown is that the Kaddesh has two identities. One is Kiddush, and one is the first of the 4 cups of wine. We haven't yet got to the 4 cups of wine. But in terms of Kiddush, the Kiddush of Pesach is derived from the Kiddush of Shabbat. Just as Shabbat, we remember God creating the world. On Pesach, we remember God redeeming the Jewish nation. On Shabbat, we remember God doing so with words and with wine. So too we do on Pesach. And it's as if, just as we rest on Shabbat to acknowledge God creating the world, we speak about the Exodus to remember what God did in terms of bringing the Jewish people out of Egypt. Just before we go on, any thoughts about this the interrelationship between Shabbat and Pesach, the Kiddush of Shabbat, the Kiddush of Pesach? They are happy to take any questions. If not, we'll move on. Okay. Now, let's do a little bit of a further dive about the Kaddesh as Kiddush. Now, remember, we said that when the Jewish people were enslaved, of course, they weren't able to have control of their time, which is why Yetziat Mitzrayim was soon followed by the mitzvah of Shabbat. Shabbat reminds us that we can be in control of aspects of our time, and we're able to rest on the 7th day. However, there is an important yesod, there's an important principle in Judaism. No matter how much you try, Shabbat comes in when Shabbat comes in. However quickly or slowly it takes you to prepare for Shabbat, Shabbat comes in, or whatever time we're told that Shabbat comes in. But actually, when it comes to the festivals, we determine when the festivals occur. Now, that may sound strange nowadays, but remember that it used to be that the new moon was declared by witnesses. That means witnesses determined when a new moon was seen, and as a result of that, once a new moon was seen, we could then say when certain festivals would fall. And so, while Shabbat happens cyclically, no matter what we do, every 7 days it's Shabbat, the festivals occur when we determine when a certain month has begun, and as a result, when a certain festival begins. I say that as a prelude for us to understand the following commentary of Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs himself is quoting from Rav Pam in Atara LaMelech, and he explains the notion of Kiddush in terms of time, in terms of Pesach, in terms of slavery, and in terms of freedom. And he says as follows: Kiddush has a particular connection with Pesach, since a command to establish the calendar was first given to the Israelites in Egypt prior to the Exodus. Remember the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim, in Shemot chapter 12, while Bnei Israel was still in Egypt. That is to say, the first gift that God gave to the Jewish people, even before we were given the mitzvah of Shabbat, was to be able to be control of our time, to determine when certain months began, and determine basically the Jewish calendar. HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim was empowering for the Jewish people, because it said, though you were slaves until now, you're now going to have a chance of being able to be in control of your own time. As he says, this was the first command given to Israel as a people. Rav Pam explained this in the following way: the difference between a slave and a free human being does not lie in how long or hard they work. Free people often work long hours doing arduous tasks. The difference lies in who controls time. A slave works until he or she is allowed to stop. A free person decides when to begin and when to end. So control over time is the essential difference between slavery and freedom. Thus, when Bnei Israel were ebbing out of Egypt, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, gave them the mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. The determination of the calendar that God gave to the Israelites the power to decide when the new moon occurred, and thus when the festivals occurred. They were given authority over time. Now, the festivals are sanctified by the Jewish people through their determination of the calendar. Thus, on festivals, we end the Kiddush by saying, Kaddesh Yisrael v'azmanim. God sanctifies the Jewish people, who are then empowered to determine when the festivals occur. Now, why is therefore this so significant? We begin Leil Seder with Kiddush. What is Kiddush? Kiddush is both connected to the idea of sanctifying wine with words. Not only is it derived from Shabbat, and Shabbat giving off the message of us being free, but Kiddush also means being able to determine that this is a festive day. And that's determined by witnesses saying we saw a new moon. And that means we have control over time. And who has control over time? Free people. And so Kiddush itself is demonstrative of being free to determine time. So we begin the Seder by making Kiddush and making a declaration. God empowered the Jewish people even before they left Egypt with a mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, that they could be Mekadesh Hazmanim because God was Mekadesh them. And so as we stand up and make Kiddush on this festive day, we celebrate the power to be free, to choose, and to determine how we use our time, in many ways to determine our whole Jewish calendar. So before we even get to the Arba Kosot, we realize that the Kiddush that we say on Leil Seder is connected to Shabbat, and thereby connected to creation and to recognizing God's power over the world and to being free, because that's what Shabbat is, about not working. And also the Kiddush is connected to, obviously, the Zman, the Chag, the Kaddesh Yisrael Bazmanim, and we therefore declare to God, thank you for giving us the gift of being able to determine our time and thereby being free people. So even when Pesach doesn't fall on Shabbat, there's an element of Shabbat in the Kiddush that we say, and the very fact that we're determining when the Chag falls is further reflective of us being free to choose how to use our time, free to us to have control over our Jewish time. Ad kan, so far, we've spoken about the Kiddush, the first aspect of Kaddesh. But you'll remember that Kaddesh also is the first of the 4 cups of wine. What we're going to do now is explore what it means to be the first of the 4 cups of wine, obviously overlapping with some of the themes that we've seen so far regarding Kiddush and Shabbat, Kiddush and Yom Tov, Kiddush and being able to determine the calendar and be free to choose how we use and sanctify our time. Before segueing to that, any questions about the Kaddesh and the Kiddush? No pressure. I'm always happy to hear questions, have feedback.
It was amazing, and it really was some Kiddush. Thank you so much.
You're very kind. I'm not machadash anything, just sharing some beautiful Torah ideas. But it's important for us to be aware of the multi-layered meaning of Kiddush, especially on Pesach. Connected to Shabbat, connected to Chag, connected to freedom, connected to controlling time, connecting to seeing God in the world and celebrating God as the one who brought us out of Egypt. And thus the Kiddush itself is connected to the Magid. You understand? Because, as Rambam says, if we learn from Zachar at Yom Hazeh Asher Atzatem in Mitzrayim that we're supposed to tell about the miracles and the wonders, and if that's a verse that teaches about Kiddush, then the moment we're starting to say Kiddush, we're already fulfilling an aspect of the Magid. We're already telling part of the story of having left Egypt, already celebrating God as being the creator of the world, the master of the world, and the one who's empowered us to be able to have control over our time. Now, let's now talk about the Arba Kosot, the 4 cups. And oftentimes we think we know a lot about the Arba Kosot, and we may well do so. But remember, when you're thinking about the Kaddesh, I want us to consider the interrelationship between the Kiddush aspect and the first of the 4 cups of wine. And in order to understand the first of the 4 cups of wine, we need to ask ourselves, why do we have 4 cups of wine, or what's the reasons for the 4 cups of wine? Well, we have 4 cups of wine because Chazal say so. What are the reasons? Well, the Bavli doesn't tell us, but the Yerushalmi gives 4 different answers to the for why we have 4 cups of wine, of which one, the first reason, is considered by Rashi to be the Ikar reason, the primary reason. And it's perhaps the reason we best know. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbanaya, Keneged Arba Geulot, the 4 cups of wine correspond to the 4 expressions of redemption that we have here in Shemot Perek Vav, Lechen emor levnei Yisrael ani Hashem, v'hotzeiti etchem mitachat tzivlot Mitzrayim, I shall take you out from under the burdens of Egypt, v'itzalti etchem me'avodatam, I shall rescue you from having to serve them, v'ga'alti etchem mizor netiyav shvatim gedolim, I shall redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments, v'lakachti etchem li la'am, and I'll take you for me as a people. You may well know that the psukim continue to talk about veheveti, and some people say, does that mean we should have a fifth cup of wine? And be aware that I'm going to be giving a session for Web Yeshiva about the fifth cup of wine in a few weeks' time. But here we're going to focus on the first of the 4 cups of wine, which is what the Kaddesh is. So according to this explanation of Rabbi Yochanan B'Shem Rabbanaya, the first cup of wine that we make, the Kaddesh, is corresponding with V'hotzeti etchem mitachat sivlot Mitzrayim. I'll take you out from the burdens of Egypt. And of course, that works very well with what we've said so far. Because if Kiddush is about recognizing that God is the one who took us out of Egypt, and it's about us being free people, and it's connected to Shabbat and connected to Chag, V'hotzeti very much flows in that way, very much fits, dovetails beautifully with those messaging. So far, that is Rabbi Yochanan B'Shem Rabbanaya's explanation for the 4 cups of wine. But the Yerushalmi then gives 3 further reasons, and it's important to know that it does, even though many of us perhaps are less familiar with these 3 further reasons. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi Amar, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, "Keneged arba kosot shel paro." In fact, the 4 cups of wine corresponded to the 4 cups of the butler in Pharaoh's dream. Were you aware that the 4 cups of wine have got something to do with Pharaoh's dream? Right? This is not about the story of the Exodus, but of course, this happens much earlier on. Though certainly it's happening in Egypt. So the 4 cups of wine you drink correspond to the cups that Pharaoh dreams about. Though he is dreaming them in terms of perhaps his own grandeur and his own power, we drink these cups perhaps as our own form of leader, demonstrating the fact that God overpowered Pharaoh, and our kos really is somehow to correspond with his arba kosot. Now, if that were to be the case, what is the first cup of wine that we drink at Kaddesh? And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. And I took grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I placed the cup in Pharaoh's palm, and you'll place Pharaoh's cup in his hand. So the first reference to kos in that pasuk corresponds to the first cup of wine that we drink in the Kaddesh, in the Kiddush. What do we learn from that? Well, I suppose we learn that Baruch Hashem, we're not the slaves of Pharaoh. We are the avadim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We are avdei Hashem, lo avdei Paro. It's as if almost that the cups that we drink are there to say, had God not taken us out of Egypt, we would be still connected to this guy with his 4 cups. But thank God, God took us out of Egypt. And as a result of this, we're able to drink these 4 cups of freedom, not of slavery. That's explanation number 2. Explanation number 3, given by Rabbi Levi, Amar Keneged Arba Malchiot. These correspond to the 4 kingdoms. I've put in brackets Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman, meaning the 4 further Malchiot that the Jewish people had to contend with after the Shibud Mitzrayim. So that the 4 cups of wine almost gave chizuk to the Jewish people, that just as we came out of those times of Egypt, we've come out and we will come out of all these other Arba Malchiot. Just as we were able to exit the enslavement of Egypt, so too we'll be able to exit the enslavement and the galut brought about from these other Malchiot. So, in this case, if we understand that this is referring to the Galut Bavel, we raise our first cup of wine and we say, though we were exiled to Babylon, we were able to come back and rebuild the temple, and just goes to show. I suppose it demonstrates the resilience of the Jewish people. We begin Seder night by saying the Egyptians tried to enslave us and we were able to let free, and other nations have tried to enslave us and we were able to thereby reestablish ourselves, in that case, in the land of Israel, and rebuild the temple. And please God, we'll be able to do that once again. That's answer number 3. Answer number 4, the Rabbanon Amrei Keneged Dal Kaisa Shel Puranius. Shekadosh Baruch Hu Atit Lashkat Et Umas Ha'olam. These correspond to the 4 cups of affliction which HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, will eventually serve to the nations of the world, and corresponding to them, God will serve Bnei Israel 4 cups of comfort. Now, this is a little bit more esoteric, but it seems to talk about retribution and also comforting. The idea that God will give it to the other nations and God will comfort us. And this will come as an expression of 4 cups. I mean, just listen to that Lashon, Arba Kosot Shel Nechamot. I think the Jewish people right now very much need Nechama. We need comfort, we need redemption, we need salvation. And please God, by the time that Pesach comes, things will be different. We'll be able to drink 4 cups of comfort. Nevertheless, what we've seen so far is that there are different identities of these 4 cups of wine. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the Shem Rabbanaya, one is about the Arba Lashonot Shel Gula. According to Rabbi Shua ben Levi, to do the 4 kosot of Par'ah. According to Rabbi Levi, it is the Arba Malchiyot. According to Rabbanon, these are the Arba kosot Shel Paranot or Shel Nechamot. And I should add also, some mystics add further explanations. I believe it's a Shlar Kaddesh who says that the Yud Kei Vav Kei is representing the 4 cups of wine, and others talk about different things to do with Shvirat HaKelim. But nevertheless, these are the 4 reasons given in the Talmud Yerushalmi, although, as mentioned, Rashi makes it clear that the Ikar reason, the primary reason for why we have the 4 cups of wine is this one, and in case of the first cup of wine, we're talking about V'hot Seiti. I'll take you out of Egypt as God did. Any questions on this so far? Now, we've seen some kind of correlation between... Sorry, please? Sorry, somebody was just saying something, I didn't quite catch that.
Oh, the ideas are very nice.
Baruch Hashem, they're beautiful, and of course, they give richness to understand the rituals that we're doing. They make us think about different parts of the story, both when we were in Egypt and when we are leaving Egypt, as well as events that took place since having left Egypt, such as the 4 kingdoms, and of course, one which is slightly more to do with almost either a messianic age or a better time of God giving comfort to the Jewish people and God dealing with our enemies in which way that needs to happen. So these 4 cups represent experience, they represent dream, they represent having been either enslaved or exiled, they represent retribution and hope and comfort. But remember, we're now focusing on the first cup. And let's do so while learning a further teaching. Now, this teaching may not necessarily seem to have much to do with what we're learning, but as we're going to see in a moment with the Meshach Chochmah, it has a lot to do with what we're learning. You may have heard the idea that the Jewish people maintained some aspect of Jewish values and practice while in Egypt. There is a teaching that they slid spiritually to the 49th level of Tum'ah, or they were very much assimilated in many different ways. But there were 4 mitzvot, 3 mitzvot, 4 mitzvot, different texts have different teachings that they held onto even while they were in Egypt. And what were these mitzvot? Well, according to this Mechilta, they were shalom nechashadu ala arayot. They were not suspect of illicit relations, meaning no matter how bad things got in Egypt, Bnei Israel behaved themselves sexually and made sure that they were monogamous, and made sure that they were loyal to one another, and they didn't have any illicit relations. Lo al lashon hara, they didn't speak lashon hara, they didn't speak slander to one another, they didn't speak badly about one another. V'lo shanu et shemam, they didn't change their names, they didn't completely lose sight of where they'd come from in terms of their origins. Of course, oftentimes our names are the names of a great-grandparent that's been passed on, and so it reminds us of our past. And so they didn't change their names, they maintained that sense of their identity. And they didn't change their language. Now, this teaching is written in the English, it has a question mark, because they're saying, is this not the four mitzvot that the Jewish people held on to? But in fact, by making the statement, it implies that the Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, adhere to these four things. Lo nechshdu al harayot, lo lashon hara, lo shanut shemam, lo shanut leshonam. You may well recall there's a section in the Haggadah where we talk about how Bnei Israel were mitsuyanim. That means that they were identifiable. You say, how are they identifiable? And the answer would be through 1, 2, 3, or all four of these things that maintain them as a goy mikerev goy, that they didn't fully assimilate. They maintained their own unique identity. And that's how Am Yisrael were able to stay somewhat separate. And that's how they were able to extract themselves when the time came for the redemption. Bonnie.
Hi, and thank you very much. I am loving the shiur. Forgive me for not turning my camera on. With regard to Lashon Hara,
Yeah.
when Moshe defends the Israelite from the slave master, he needs to flee because he's worried for his safety, which indicates to me that there's a certain amount of socialization of the event to others. So I guess I have an issue with that one particular aspect.
Well, firstly, the question is, at that moment, maybe people didn't see it, but pretty soon they may well have done so. But secondly, it's important to know, actually, Moshe is an outlier to the Jewish people until that point. He is, if you want to use a Disney phrase, a Prince of Egypt, right? So he is not the Am Yisrael that I'm describing. The Am Yisrael themselves, according to this tradition, by the way, there's a lot of commentaries who discuss the veracity of this tradition and with the arguments as to where this came from. Rabbi Eli Fisher has a nice piece about this, quoting the Chatam Sofer, but be that as it may. Moshe himself was somewhat separate from the Jewish people. In fact, if you look at the Ibn Ezra on that passage, it seems that until that point, when it refers to his brothers, he was thinking about the Egyptians. So only through that moment of identifying with the pain of the Israelites did he align himself more with the Israelites. That doesn't necessarily mean that Israelites align themselves with him. Only when he returned does he try and then become part of the leader of the nation. But he is somewhat separate from them. So I don't mean, if that's the challenge, I mean, obviously it's an important question, but what Am Yisrael said about Moshe in that moment, I don't think negates their general maintenance of speaking. Well, by the way, it doesn't mean everyone spoke perfectly and didn't raise their voice, but it means they didn't slander one another. They had enough trouble. They didn't need to go out and make their lives worse. And Moshe, I don't think they necessarily deliberately spoke badly about him, but he himself wasn't part of that club at that point in time. He was a separate being who then joined the people. And in fact, it took a while for them to warm to him, of course, because only Aaron basically became, it's as if to say, he's my brother, right? And then, okay. So Aaron
Great,
then
thank you
vouches
so
for
much.
them.
This is great.
My pleasure. So far what we've looked at is, we've mentioned the Kaddesh, and we've said that Kiddush has this association of it being rooted in Shabbat, but then about remembering the day of leaving Egypt, and therefore the mitzvah of talking about the Exodus is a parallel to the mitzvah of remembering the Shabbat day. And we see this even more explicit in this midrash, such that Shabbat remembers creation and the Kiddush of Pesach remembers the Exodus. And then we mentioned how the Kiddush is about being Kaddesh Yisrael v'azmanim. And so Kiddush is about time, freedom. It's about the ability to have the liberty to say when is a holy time and when is not a holy time. And so we begin Shabbat with Kiddush to remind ourselves that Shabbat is about freedom. We begin a festive day with Kiddush for a similar reason. And now when we're talking about the 4 cups of wine, apologies, we've given 4 reasons for the 4 cups of wine. That of Rabbi Yochanan, quoting Rabbi Naya, of the Arba Lashonot Shel Gula. We've seen the other 3 reasons about Pharaoh's cup and the Abba Malchiot, and the opinion about the Kosot Shel Pranut and Kosot Shel Nechamot. And now we've mentioned this teaching from the Mechilta of saying these are the 4 things that help Am Yisrael maintain a certain unique identity, shiur mitzuyanim. They were distinct. That's why in modern Hebrew, mitzuyan means like distinction. Now, why did I share this teaching with you? Because it was in preparation of really the pièce de résistance of our learning, which is a Meshech Chochmah. Rameir Simcha Dvinsk, who has an ingenious analysis of the 4 cups, which connects the first opinion of the Yerushalmi with this teaching of the Mechilta. So I'll say that again. We're now about to take this explanation of Rabbi Yochanan, quoting Rabbi Naya, about the Arba Lashonot Shel Gula, and bind it with this idea of the Jewish people maintaining 4 different inequalities which help them remain distinct Mitzuyanim. And comes along the Meshech Chochmah, and he says as follows. Just to let you know, this is a quarter of the Meshech Chochmah, because all this bit does is talk about the first of the 4 cups of wine. Then there are 3 further paragraphs talking about the other 3 cups of wine. But he tells us, Daled kosot keneged daled lashonot shel gula. The 4 cups corresponded to the 4 expressions of redemption, as we saw in the Yerushalmi, and as I mentioned, according to Rashi, that's an ikar reason, that's a primary reason. But seiti v'tzalti v'ga'alti v'lakachti, and I'll take you out, and I'll save you, and I'll redeem you, and I will take you further. Now, then the question is, what is the first cup of wine? Well, Kos Rishon, Kiddush, the first cup of wine on Leila Seder is Kiddush. And what is Kiddush? Kiddush, the Yisrael Mekadshei Zmanim. Remember that teaching of Rabbi Sachs? Quoting Rav Pam, Israel sanctify time. And so we make Kiddush to demonstrate our ability to make decisions on and be able to show our empowerment to determine how we use our time. Kamosha Amru, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. Just as we saw that the first commandment given to the Jewish people was HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. So can you see already this first 2 and a bit lines is almost a review of that teaching of Rabbi Sachs, quoting Rav Avram Pam. The 4 cups corresponding to the 4 expressions of redemption. The first cup is Kiddush. Kiddush is because we can sanctify our time, because we have the ability to control our time, because God gave us the ability to determine when a new moon is, and therefore when a new month starts. The question is, what qualifies us to be able to do so? What qualifies us to be able to determine time? It is that God has sanctified us. Kaddesh Yisrael v'azmanim. Remember that expression? God sanctifies the Jewish people, who are then able to sanctify time. Well, if God sanctifies the Jewish people need to be sanctified. Ematai, when are the Jewish people capable of determining basically when a new moon is and when a new month is? What are the essential core qualities of the Jewish people to be able to do that? Kshem Kadoshim, when they are sanctified, when they are holy. Now, what does it mean to be holy? That's an interesting question. Well, I do know that the Torah tells us in Vayikra chapter 19 that we should be holy. And it tells us, Kadoshim to you, you shall be holy. And you may well know that the prior chapter, chapter 18, tells us about inappropriate, illicit relationships. And that Rashi there, in his commentary to Kadoshim to you, says, be holy, meaning don't commit illicit relationships. Wherever you find people being boundaried about inappropriate relationships, that's where you find holiness. Now, you can see how these ideas are coming together. In fact, we are told that the Jewish people are greater than the great angels. Why? Because the Jewish people are told that we can be doubly holy. I've sanctified you and you shall be holy. That is, I've sanctified you that you can sanctify time. Remember, your task is to be sanctified, to be holy, as interpreted by Vayikra chapter 18, 19, being careful about how you live your lives, and making sure you have sanctified relationships. Comes along the Meshech Chochmah and now says, when the Jewish people were boundaried about the relationships they had in Egypt, and they stayed away from illicit relationships, which was one of the four things that maintained their uniqueness, maintained their mitsuyanim, then God was able to extract them, because they were already separate, distinct. If that wasn't the case, basically the Jewish people would have been mixed together. They wouldn't have been able to be distinct. What the Meshech Chochmah tells us is something absolutely ingenious, which is, here we're told that the first of the 4 cups of wine is Votzeti. And here we're told one of the 4 reasons which enabled the Jewish people to stay distinct, that they were not suspect of illicit relations, meaning that they kept holy. We have the first cup of wine, which expresses Votzeti. How was God able to basically identify the Jewish people? Because they remained identifiable. And one of the reasons through doing so is because they remained Kedoshim. And so Kaddesh corresponds to that mitzvah of being Kadosh. The Kaddesh that we say at the beginning of Leila Seder corresponds to that aspiration and that endeavor and that commitment of being holy that Am Yisrael did while in Egypt. And because they were Kadosh, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was able to take us out of Mitzrayim. And that's why that first cup of wine is a Kiddush cup. Isn't that ingenious? So what you have here is a multi-layered meaning of Kaddesh. And I want us to do a review now before we finish up. Because once we understand the dual identity of Kaddesh, actually you realize that this is a multi-layered identity of Kaddesh. And not only is it a Kiddush of Yom Tov of Pesach, but it's also the first of the 4 cups of wine. As we mentioned, the Mishnah Berurah says we should be very clear that we have the intention that when we make Kiddush, that we're doing so both Kadesh, to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush, and L'kayem mitzvah Dala Kosot, and to fulfill the first of 4 cups of wine. Why is it so important to think about this dual identity? Well, because a dual identity carries with it different messages and messaging. In terms of Kiddush, we begin with Shabbat, because we learn the Kiddush of Pesach or Yom Tov from the Kiddush for Shabbat. Why is that significant? Well, in fact, because we've only learnt what it means to meaningfully change our lives and honor God through Shabbat, which has then informed us what it means to change our lives and act in a way which demonstrates our awareness of something profound, which we then do on Leil Seder. We sanctify with wine, we sanctify with words on Shabbat. So too we sanctify with wine, we sanctify with words on Pesach. And so the Midrash Rabbah tells us, just like creates the world, and I said to the Jewish people to remember the Shabbat day and to remember the creation, and I say remember the Shabbat day and sanctify it, so to remember the miracles. And so we make the Kiddush on Leil Seder as a corresponding act to the Kiddush we make on Shabbat. But beyond that, the very fact that we make a Kiddush on Yom Tov demonstrates the fact that we have a Yom Tov. How do we have a Yom Tov? Because of the mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. This shall mark for you the beginning of the month. And God commands the Jewish people, even while in Egypt, the first gift is you can have control over your time. This is what it means to be free. And so in Egypt, we determine this is going to be the first month. And so on the night of Pesach, we say, Kaddesh Yisrael ba'azmanim. We nod our head to HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, by virtue, and in so doing, saying, if God hadn't given us that command, we wouldn't even have the months, we wouldn't even have the festivals, we wouldn't be able to sanctify the Jewish calendar. And so the Kiddush aspect of Kaddesh references back to Shabbat and references back to the mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, but both are rooted in the notion of freedom, of not being slaves, but instead being able to choose how we use our time. Then we move on to the first of the 4 cups of wine. We said there are 4 different reasons given in Yerushalmi, and other reasons given by different Mefarshim. The first is the Arba Lashonot Shel Gula, starting with V'Hotzeti. The second is a Pharaoh's cup. The third is the Arba Malchiot. The fourth is to do with these cups of affliction and cups of comfort that Kadosh Baruch Hu will eventually in the future pour out to the nations and for the Jewish people. We still said that the Ikar reason is the Arba Lashonot Shel Gula, V'Hotzeti being the first cup. But then we mentioned the Mechilta to Rabbi Yishmael, and we said there are 4 reasons that help the Jewish people stay distinct, with the first being Shelo Nechashadu ala Arayot, which basically means that the Jewish people were Kadosh. And so the Meshech Chochmah brings it all together, and he says, we make Kiddush, and in so doing demonstrate our ability to be Kaddish Zman. But how are we able to do that? Because we were Kadosh. And where do we see that we were Kadosh? But that we saw in the Mechilta that one of the things that kept the Jewish people distinct, which enabled V'Hotzeti, is that we weren't Nechashadu ala Arayot, that we maintained the right relationships, and therefore the Kiddush represents the notion of Kedusha of Am Yisrael. Now, bringing this all together, as we start Leil Seder, what should be our kavanah? I mentioned the kavanah that the Mishnah Berurah said we should say, the Hareini that I have in my mind that I'm making Kiddush, I'm having the 4 cups of wine. What should be my kavanah? I'd say it should be that Am Yisrael, according to tradition, were on the 49th level of Tum'ah. That, yeah, they were really, really strained and disconnected from so much, but they held on to certain core values. Those 4 core values mentioned by the Mechilta. And those 4 core values made us worthy, that God said, I do want to bring them out of Mitzrayim. And God takes us out of Egypt. And God gives us the ability to control our time. And God blesses us with the Shabbat. And then God gives us the commandments. And we come along to Seder night. And we stand there, and we make the Kiddush. And we say, what does it mean to be a Jewish person who was able to be extracted from such a hard situation? It is that Kadosh Baruch Hu saw our uniqueness as our nation, our Kedusha as a nation. And in so doing, God was able to bring us out. And God blessed us. And we now bear witness to all of this with the language and with the blessings that we say in the Kiddush, while referencing God as a creator, while referencing God as a redeemer, and while referencing Yetziat Mitzrayim, while referencing the blessing of time, because by being able to sanctify time, we are free and we are not slaves. So I hope this is a useful framing for understanding the Kaddesh, both in terms of Kiddush and in terms of Arba Kosot. Of course, this year, more than any other in my life, we pray that there shouldn't be any people being held by the time of making Kiddush. We pray that everybody who's being held hostage are freed. And we pray that the Zechuyot of Am Yisrael, since Yetziat Mitzrayim until now, serves as a way to enable all those who are in danger to be freed from there, and all those who are having a hard time are able to celebrate Pesach with their families. And so Pesach this year, of course, carries so much more meaning. But knowing our story and knowing what the Arba Kosot mean and knowing what Kiddush means helps us know what it means to be a Jew. What it means to be a Jew is to be separate, it's to be different, it's to be holy, it's to aspire to great things, and is to be able to know how we use our time and to do so properly, to tell our story, to remember the miracles that God has done in the past for the Jewish people, and please God, we should see many more miracles in the very near future. Any further comments before we wrap up?
Amen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
Thank
And
you.
thank
Put a lot more meaning.
Pesach Sameach to
Put a lot
everybody.
more meaning into what we'll be doing.
Thank you, Bonnie. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to write to me. And of course, feel free to follow all the other shiurim being given by Web Yeshiva teachers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.